The Board of Deputies of British Jews is the largest organisation representing Jewish people in Britain. Of course, not every British Jew takes themselves to be represented by the group, which has always taken a pretty hardline stance in its support for Israel. But that now may be changing. 36 members of the board, that's about 10% of the deputies, have now signed an open letter published in the Financial Times condemning Israel's assault on Gaza. In their letter, the deputies explain they can no longer remain silent over the attack because, quote, silence is seen as support for policies and actions that run contrary to our Jewish values. And one of the signatories is Philip Goldenberg, who explained his position to the BBC.
It is awful and is betrayal of Jewish ethical values. Look, this war could have come to an end and the hostages could have been released. Netanyahu deliberately revived it so as to lure back into his government some bigoted extreme racists to keep his majority so he doesn't lose office. It's as simple and crude as that.
Right. I mean, the people that he lured back, as you say, into his government represent a considerable, albeit a minority, but a considerable body of opinion in Israel.
Yes, it's a democratic society. Different people have different views.
Was there a tipping point for you?
I think the tipping point was Netanyahu's decision deliberately to restart the war for his own political reasons. And I think that was so outrageous.
And the effect of what is going on in Israel, what effect is it having on Jews that you know in the UK?
Look, there is a significant problem of anti-Semitism, as indeed there is a significant problem of Islamophobia. And most people don't actually distinguish between Israelis and Jews. So Muslims get smeared with the collective guilt for 9/11 or what Hamas did on the 7th of October. British Jews get smeared with the collective guilt for the actions of the Israeli government.
Helena, how significant do you think this letter is?
I think it's incredibly important, because the biggest argument that you get from the pro-Israel argument is that there is something innately connecting Zionism and Jewishness, which of course there isn't. Or indeed, this idea that if you have taking a hardline stance against the actions of the Israeli government, then there must be something anti-Semitic there, even if it's entirely on the grounds of just what's happening in the offensive in Gaza, not in terms of Zionism versus anti-Zionism. A lot of arguments you hear, well, you only take this position with Israel and nobody else, therefore it's anti-Semitic, right? When I think that it's understandable for people like what you just heard there, that we see the Board of Deputies as being there to represent the interests of the British Jewish community at large, which is politically and ideologically diverse and is not entirely unified. And so seeing this explicitly being made as a group that does represent them, saying, well, no, there is internal conflict on this issue. You can't paint an entire ethno-religious group that's a minority in a country as entirely having their position tied to the actions of a foreign government that makes its own case to being an ethno-state of that ethno-religious group. Therefore, it would undermine these people in this country if they can have their own existence tied to foreign policy decisions elsewhere. And it's frustrating. I've had other Jewish people have been very critical of the Board of Deputies acting on the interest of what is good for Israel and not of the British Jewish community. And I'm assuming people like the guy you just heard there find that very aggravating too. Like, no, we absolutely take opposition to what's happening in Gaza. We absolutely take opposition to it. And that is central to Jewish values. A lot of Bundists would agree, you know. Michael Brooks was asked about this. The late, great Michael Brooks was asked about this. And he said, well, what Israel does is contrary to everything that I was taught to believe as a Jewish person. My Jewish values absolutely reject the actions of the Israeli government. And so having this delineation being explicit, because the highest kind of institution that represents the Jewish community in Britain at large say, no, we need to separate what is good for us as a group of people, as an ethno-religious group, away from what's good from what's happening within the state of Israel. Making these explicit and separate is super important for having I hate to say this phrase, but a grown-up, an adult discussion about what happens in Israel without people trying to condemn you for having some ulterior motive for why you oppose things like war crimes or violations of international law, which should be something you should be able to have a conversation around without people trying to undermine your motivations as being based upon what happens with regards to the ethnic makeup of the state that you're criticizing. And so having it explicitly being made that case by somebody who's there ostensibly and correctly as a representation of, as a part of the representation of the Jewish community at large, shows that you can't pigeonhole this into being about the ethno-religious group in question. It's about the state, it's about the ideology, it's about what's happening in practice, and dividing those two is incredibly important for the way in which we approach the entire discussion of Israel at large. One last point on top of this as well is that I think what's scary, it should be scary for a lot of Jewish people in this country, is that this idea that Israel and the international Jewish community are one and the same, that makes anti-Semitism worse. It does make anti-Semitism worse, right? Actual anti-Semites can use this not just as a justification, but as cover. Like there are lots of genuine anti-Semites who say, I'm just an anti-Zionist. Don't try and lump me in with the anti-Semites when what they're saying is anti-Semitic. So without that delineation, it gives these people plausible deniability for their anti-Semitism, right? Which gets covered up from the other side, calling everybody's anti-Zionist anti-Semitic. Whereas if we can have a discussion where we can delineate these things away from each other, then that makes everybody much more aware of where the real anti-Semitism lies, rather than trying to conflate the two things together between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that's important to have as well. Just the one, because the Jewish community at large shouldn't be connected to Israel because of all the things that they're doing. That genocide isn't a Jewish value. Like, I don't know how else to say it.